On May 1st, 1942, a patched PBY seaplane carrying PT boat survivors escaped Lake Lanao as the crew desperately fought to keep the damaged aircraft airborne. Hospital corpsman Charles Beckner scrambled into the waist compartment and slashed the rope holding a makeshift blanket patch which had been improvised to cover a tear in the hull from earlier reefs. The blanket tore away, and the plane barely cleared the jungle-clad mountains, pointing its nose toward Australia and safety. It was the end of a desperate journey for the men of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. Their story begins weeks earlier in March 1942 on the island of Mindanao. March 14th, 1992, the survivors of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had brought General MacArthur to Mindanao, delivered him to the Del Monte airfield, and watched him fly to Australia. Now they sat at anchor off the tiny barrio of Bugo, waiting. John Bulkley gathered the men and told them the squadron was suspended until word came that MacArthur was safe. No operations, no patrols, just silence and heat. For men who had spent weeks running through Japanese patrols, dodging destroyers, and burying friends, the order felt like a held breath. But nothing on Mindanao stayed peaceful for long. The Japanese had already occupied Davao on the southern coast, and their troops were gathering. This was not a rest. It was a pause before the noose tightened. That same morning, the Army paymaster arrived at Bugo with a table, 2 MPs, and a stack of cash. The men lined up to sign for $100 each. Some took Filipino pesos instead of US dollars, thinking the local currency might prove more useful if the Japanese cut off the islands. Charles Conrad Beckner watched the line and made his choice. He already carried plenty of US bills, half in his pocket, half in his sea bag. He knew the Japanese were coming. He knew he might have to move fast and light, so he took every dollar of his pay in pesos. The clerk looked at him twice, then pushed a thick stack of colorful notes across the table. Beckner stuffed them into his belt pouch, feeling the weight of paper that might buy a bank a ride, a meal, or a bribe when the escape routes closed. The next morning was Sunday, and 7 Catholic crewmen headed into Cagayan for Mass. Charles Conrad Beckner was not Catholic, but he went anyway. He slipped away from the group and walked back to a small chapel at the Ateneo de Cagayan, the Jesuit college near the town center. The chapel was cool and empty. He lit 2 candles, one for Tilly, the nurse he had left behind on Luzon, one for the crew of PT-32, a prayer that they had somehow found their way to safety. A priest appeared behind him. Father Edward Haggerty, an American Jesuit, introduced himself. He spoke easily, and within minutes he revealed something that stunned Beckner. He had seen MacArthur get off the boat. He had even spoken with the general at Del Monte. MacArthur had told him that Bataan could not hold, that he was ordered to Australia, and that the Japanese would get nothing but bullets. Beckner said nothing. The padre knew everything, and the secret was already useless. After Mass, Father Haggerty invited Beckner to dine with a local family, the Paradise family. They lived above their hardware store across from the college. The meal was long and warm, with rice, adobo, and fresh pie brought by the priest. Beckner sat among the Paradise brothers and their wives, listening to their talk of the war. One of the guests, a young businessman named Enrique Abuatiz from Cebu, spoke quietly about the Moros, the Muslim tribes of the southern islands. He warned Beckner never to travel alone through Moro country. They resisted the Spanish, they resisted the Americans, and they would resist any foreigner who crossed their land without permission or protection. Beckner listened and filed it away. He had a map now, a Texaco road map someone had given him. He had pesos in his belt, and he had a gathering sense that the easy days on Mindanao would not last. On the evening of March 16th, the starboard section took shore leave in Cagayan. The men found a bar at the far end of town, drinking beer and local whiskey under dim, bare bulbs. Henry Rook, the squadron cook, sat with a young Filipino woman on his lap. She laughed at everything he said, though neither understood the other's language. The mood was loose and careless, the first real relaxation the crew had known in weeks. Then the lights went out. A single gunshot cracked through the dark, and when the bulbs flickered back on, the woman was still on Rook's lap. Her head was a bloody ruin. Rook looked at the squadron's corpsman, Charles Conrad Beckner, with helpless eyes. Beckner lifted her to the floor and checked for a pulse. There was none. A jealous Filipino lover had shot her through the window and fled, dropping Rook's own .45 pistol outside the door. Bulkley acted fast. The next morning he banned all sidearms during shore leave and restricted the men to base. The squadron was bleeding away its margin for error. One dead civilian, one lost weapon, and a Japanese army drawing closer every day. The easy liberty was over. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. On March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, the port section returned from evening mess to find PT-34 dragging anchor. The shackle pin had broken, another casualty of worn parts and no spares. By the time the crew reacted, the boat was grinding onto a coral reef. The first engine roared to life, but the propellers thumped against rock and the boat would not move. Waves pushed her harder onto the sharp shelf. For 2 days the crew fought to free her. A small tug called the Misamis could not budge the hull. Army laborers dynamited a channel through the coral. Then Father Edward Haggerty appeared in a punt with 2 Army majors. He raised his hand and blessed the boat. At that same moment, PT-34 slid free. Whether prayer or dynamite, the men did not care. She was afloat. But the grounding had mangled her shafts and propellers, and only a blacksmith's forge could make the rudimentary repairs that followed. In the weeks that followed, the squadron scattered across the southern islands. PT-35 hit a reef off Negros and was abandoned. PT-41 ferried President Quezon to safety. A torpedo warhead, a heavy steel cone packed with explosive, was rigged in PT-35's engine compartment to ensure nothing remained for the Japanese. Then came the news from Luzon. Bataan had surrendered on April 9th. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were now prisoners, and PT-34, sent on a night attack against the Japanese cruiser Kuma, was caught by aircraft at dawn and sunk. Pappy Reynolds, the first aid man, took shrapnel through the neck and belly. He died on the beach. On April 10th, Beckner stood at a cemetery on the edge of Cebu City. 2 rough wooden coffins held William Harris and Reynolds. There was no honor guard, no American flag. The only sounds were distant explosions from the burning docks and the voice of a priest, a Redemptorist named Father Luke, reading scripture. Beckner saluted as the workers closed the graves. He jogged back into town to meet Brantingham and the others at the rendezvous point, but Army roadblocks had sealed the city. Armed MPs turned him back. By the time he circled north through farms and reached the intersection, the note was already nailed to the post. Unable to wait, proceeding as planned. Good luck. Beckner marked a line through his name and left it for the others who had not arrived. After the note, Beckner walked alone into the jungle as the sun set. He reached a farmer's hut where the man fed him cornmeal and chicken and let him sleep under a lean-to. He woke at first light, ate a ball of rice and dried meat. The farmer's wife had wrapped for him and stepped back onto the mountain trail. Within an hour, he fell in with 2 men heading the same direction, an Army sergeant named Bob, stranded when his unit shipped out without him, and a sugar plantation manager named Ed, trying to get back to Negros. Beckner set a punishing pace. He wanted to catch Brantingham's group before they reached the coast. 3 hours into the walk, Beckner heard voices ahead. He signaled Bob and Ed to stop and listened. Japanese 7 infantrymen, moving east on the same trail. Beckner dropped into the thickest undergrowth he could find and pressed himself flat against the rotting leaves. One soldier walked into the brush not 10 feet from him, dropped his trousers, and squatted. Beckner held his breath and watched a beetle crawl up his leg. After 5 endless minutes, the soldier finished, slung his rifle, and rejoined the patrol. Beckner waited until the voices faded, then stood, brushed himself off, and kept walking. By nightfall, he reached the coast. Moonlight glinted off the Tanyan Strait. A small village slept at the edge of the beach, and 4 bankas, Filipino outrigger canoes, sat on the sand. Beckner crept toward the largest, hoping to sail it across alone. But it was too heavy to move. As he searched the smaller boats for a paddle, shapes emerged from the darkness. Men. Beckner crouched and drew his knife. Then a low whisper came in English. "Who's there?" He knew the voice, Eichelberger. Brantingham's group had reached the same beach, and they were stealing the same bankas. Beckner helped them shove the largest banka into the surf. The lieutenant had a plan. cross the strait to Negros, hire trucks south to Dumaguete, then find fishermen willing to take them across to Mindanao. Beckner handed over his wad of pesos. It was the pay he had taken at Bugo, the money he had chosen over dollars because he knew he might need to buy his way out. Brantingham used it to negotiate passage. By dawn they were sailing south, hugging the Negros coast, hiding below deck whenever a Japanese ship appeared on the horizon. The same fishermen who had picked them up at Dumaguete carried them straight across the Mindanao Sea to Dipolog. The crossing was calm, and the hold smelled of old fish, but the Japanese destroyers patrolling the channel stayed distant. They reached Dipolog after dark. The fishermen took their payment and hurried back to sea, leaving the sailors alone on the dock. The next morning, Brantingham found a bus, old and dilapidated but running, and paid the driver to take them inland. They climbed past Bugo, past the Del Monte pineapple fields, and pulled into the airstrip at sundown. Beckner stepped off the bus and saw it immediately. PT-41, stripped of her guns and torpedo tubes, strapped to an army trailer and abandoned at a sharp curve in the road. She had tried to make it to Lake Lanao and failed. The men stood in silence, staring at the only surviving boat of Squadron 3. Then Brantingham ordered them back on the bus. They drove on to Camp Keithley, where the Navy remnants were gathering. Camp Keithley in mid-April of 1942, the Navy remnants on Lake Lanao had reached the end of the road. They were waiting for a war that was racing toward them. Charles Beckner watched the men around him, hollow-eyed and exhausted. One morning he exploded over a cup of ersatz coffee, shouting that the military should admit there was no hope of holding the island. The outburst cleared the air, but everyone knew he was right. Days later, Seaman William Johnson collapsed with a shaking malarial fever. Beckner had a bottle of atabrine, a scarce synthetic drug he had carried from a hospital in Cebu City. He gave Johnson a loading dose of the yellow pills. The fever broke within hours. Johnson would live, and he would later man a machine gun post on the hills overlooking the lake, watching for the PBY that might save them. Then Ensign Ross Hoffman appeared with a secret assignment. He told Beckner that 2 PBY seaplanes were coming to Lake Lanao on a desperate evacuation mission. They needed to prepare a hiding place on a small island and stockpile fuel for the planes. If the operation worked, it might be their only ticket out of the Philippines. Beckner spent the next several days hauling barrels of aviation gas across the lake and camouflaging the shoreline. Before dawn on April 30th, 2 black PBY Catalinas landed on the darkened lake. Beckner recognized the pilots from his old squadron, Patrol Wing 10. Lieutenant Commander Edgar Neal and Lieutenant Tom Pollock stepped out onto the pontoons. They told Beckner he was flying out with them. He was being reassigned to Pat Wing 10, effective immediately. Later that afternoon, a Moro boat was hired to tow the first PBY into open water for takeoff. Halfway across the lake, the Moro pilot spotted submerged rocks. He cut the tow rope and abandoned the plane. The PBY drifted onto the rocks, and an 18-inch L-shaped tear ripped open the bottom of the aluminum hull. Water flooded the aft compartment faster than the pumps could drain it. The plane was beached on the island, settling into the mud. Passengers, including a group of nurses evacuated from Corregidor, were taken to shore. Captain Joseph McGuigan, a Navy ship repair officer who had been at Cavite, stripped to his skivvies and dove into the oily water to inspect the damage. He said he could improvise a patch, but he made no promises. Through the next day, McGuigan and his team worked in the water. They stuffed rubber from parachute harnesses into the tear, braced it with wooden boards cut from the island, and lashed a wool blanket around the hull to slow the leaking. The repair was ugly, but it held well enough to refloat the plane. The Japanese were coming up the road. There was no time left. At dusk on the 1st of May, Pollock gunned the engines and began the takeoff run. The heavy plane fought for lift. Halfway across the lake, the blanket tore loose and flapped against the tail rudder, dragging down the nose. Water poured back into the hull. The plane could not climb. It was heading straight for the dark mass of Signal Hill. Beckner scrambled into the waist compartment and slashed the rope with his hospital core knife. The blanket fell away. Pollock banked the PBY hard. The wings clipped the treetops, but the plane caught the air and rose. They cleared the mountain by a few feet. The Celebes Sea opened ahead of them, and Tom Pollock pointed the nose toward Darwin, Australia. Beckner served with Patrol Wing 10, then as an independent duty corpsman aboard the seaplane tender USS Heron. He later went ashore with the 1st Marines at Okinawa in 1944, where he was wounded 3 times. He retired after 31 years as the Navy's senior non-commissioned officer, dying in 2009 at Arlington with full military honors. Edward Brantingham, Edgar Neal, and Ross Hoffman each survived the war and continued their service. William Johnson escaped Mindanao on July 4, 1942, served with the Philippine guerrilla forces, and after the war became a dentist. He wrote Charles a letter in 1997, thanking him for saving his life with the Atabran tablets. John Xavier Balog married in Australia and died in Oregon in 1973. John Bulkley received the Medal of Honor and served until his burial at Arlington in 1996. Charles Beckner kept his hospital corps knife through every year of that long service. It had cut the rope on Lake Lanao. That knife stayed with him as a quiet anchor to the promise he made himself in the dark hours on Mindanao that he would never surrender. He kept that promise through 31 years, through Okinawa, through a lifetime. The men of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 bought time for a war that would be won later, paying for it in blood, coral, and salt water, but some of them came home. On the day Beckner retired, he canceled his own parade, turned off the light, closed the door, and walked away. The same quiet, stubborn refusal to yield that had carried him from the jungle to Australia. If you have family stories from the Pacific War or remember a veteran who carried his own quiet promise through those years, share them in the comments. We read every one. If you enjoyed this story of the men of Squadron 3, please subscribe and give the video a like to help us bring more of these histories to light. Thank you for listening.